Are you crazy? Let go of me now. The scream cut through the silence of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Chicago. The wedding of the century instantly became a circus. 500 members of the city's elite turned to stare. They saw a maid in a dirty uniform, her brown hair a mess. She had a death grip on the groom, Nico Fontaine, and was dragging him down the main aisle. The bride, Veronica Sterling, wore a $1 million dress. Her face went from white to red with fury. "Security, get this crazy woman out of here," she yelled. Guards moved in like a pack of wolves. The men in black suits had cold faces. They were ready to remove anyone who ruined their boss's wedding. But the maid was not afraid. She held on to Nico even tighter. Her green eyes were full of tears, but burned with pure desperation. "You are in danger," she said. "Please, just give me 1 minute." Nico Fontaine was a 36-year-old man with eyes as cold as ice. He looked at the maid, confused. He had fired this woman last night. She was a thief. Yet here she was, making a scene in front of his most important guests. The guards were close now. One nod from Nico, and she would disappear from Chicago forever. But Nico saw something in her eyes. It was not madness. It was real fear for someone else. Before the guards could grab her, Nico raised a hand to stop them. He let the maid pull him into a small room off the aisle. The heavy door shut behind them. Outside, 500 guests held their breath. Veronica stood frozen, her expensive dress suddenly looking cheap. She wanted to scream, but she did not dare. A minute passed, then 2, then 5. Whispers started to spread through the church. What was happening? Who was that maid? No one knew that in those few minutes, a powerful empire was about to change forever. It all started 48 hours before with the sound of a teacup breaking. The Fontaine estate sat outside Chicago like an old castle. It had tall stone walls and stained glass windows. A marble fountain stood in the middle of a perfect garden. The entire place screamed of wealth and power that normal people could only imagine. But beautiful surfaces can hide dark secrets. In the main sitting room, the silence was shattered. An antique teacup, worth thousands of dollars, exploded on the floor. Hot tea spilled across a priceless Persian rug. It ran toward a pair of bright red designer heels. Audrey Shaw stood perfectly still. She was 28 years old, with her brown hair tied back neatly. Her green eyes were tired, and her pale skin looked almost blue from a lack of sleep. She had worked as a maid in the mansion for 8 months. She had seen how cruel the rich could be, but this was new. The silver tray in her hand was empty. She had not dropped the cup. Veronica Sterling, Nico's fiancée, had knocked it over on purpose. Veronica stood up from the velvet sofa. Her designer dress fit her perfectly. Her beautiful face was twisted into a mask of rage. But Audrey could see the truth in her cold blue eyes. Veronica was not angry. She was pleased. She enjoyed hurting people who were weaker than her. "You filthy maid!" Veronica screamed. "Do you know what these shoes cost? More than you make in a year. How will you pay for them?" Audrey looked down. She wanted to say it was not her fault. But in this house, nobody would believe a maid over Veronica. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, stood in the corner. She had served the family for over 30 years and had seen everything. But she stayed silent and looked away. Veronica was about to become the lady of the house. Her power was almost total. "Kneel," Veronica said. Her voice was like ice. "Clean my shoes with your hands." Audrey looked up in disbelief, but Veronica's cold stare did not change. Slowly, Audrey got on her knees. Shards of broken porcelain cut into her skin through her uniform. As she wiped the red shoes, A sharp kick hit her shoulder, knocking her sideways. "Scrub harder," Veronica hissed. "And keep your poor smell off my things." Audrey bit her lip to stop from crying out. She thought about her 16-year-old brother, Tommy. He was in a hospital bed with a bad heart. The doctors told her the surgery he needed would cost $200,000. It was an amount of money she could never get on her own. This job was the only thing keeping Tommy alive. She could not lose it, even if it meant kneeling and swallowing her pride. Tears fell silently onto the floor. Heavy, confident footsteps came down the hall. Audrey was still on her knees, her hands shaking and her knees bleeding from the broken glass. Her heart pounded with fear. Nico Fontaine entered the room. He was 36 years old and stood 185 centimeters tall. He wore a perfect black suit and looked like he belonged on the cover of a magazine. He had a strong jaw and a handsome, cold face. But it was his gray eyes that scared people. They were empty and distant. No one could ever see what he was thinking. He was the head of the Fontaine family, a name that meant absolute power in Chicago's underworld. No one crossed Nico Fontaine. Nico's eyes took in the scene. He saw his angry fiancée. He saw the maid kneeling in a puddle of tea and broken china. He saw the stain on the expensive rug. He did not care about the details. And then Veronica changed. The screaming woman instantly became a fragile victim. She ran to Nico and held onto his arm. She pressed her face into his chest, her eyes filling with fake tears. She was about to cry. Her voice dripped with honey. "Nico, my love." It was a complete change from the venom she had used just seconds ago. "I only asked her for tea, and she spilled it on the shoes you gave me. My favorite shoes. I am so upset. This is a bad sign for our wedding." Audrey stayed on her knees. Her green eyes watched the performance. She wanted to scream that it was a lie, but her throat felt like it was crushed. No words would come out. Nico looked down at the maid. His gray eyes passed over her like she was a piece of furniture. He did not ask what happened. He did not look for the truth. He only felt tired. Tomorrow was his wedding, the day he would finally bury the memory of Kate, his first wife. She had died 2 years ago from a sudden heart problem. He did not need more drama. He just wanted peace. Get out. Nico's voice was cold and final. Do not cause any more problems. Next time, be careful or you will lose your job. He asked no questions. He showed no compassion. He did not even wait for an explanation. He turned away, letting Veronica hold his arm as they walked upstairs. It was as if the kneeling maid was not even there. Audrey felt a knife twist in her chest. Veronica's cruelty was painful, but Nico's indifference hurt 100 times more. He was not cruel like Veronica. He just treated her like she was air. She was not worth a single second of his time. That was the worst pain. To be treated badly meant you existed. To be ignored was to be nothing. "Yes, Mr. Fontaine?" Audrey bowed her head, her voice a tiny breath. She stood up on trembling knees. Blood from the broken porcelain soaked through her uniform. She picked up the tray, kept her head down, and left the room. She did not look back. She would not let them see her tears. Humiliation burned inside her, but she had to endure it for Tommy. His surgery cost $200,000. She could not afford to fail. She had no idea that her life was about to be pulled into a storm. Audrey walked down the long, empty hall. Her legs felt heavy. Old paintings on the walls seemed to judge her with cold eyes. Dim lights made strange shadows on the marble floor. She bit her lip and swallowed her pain. She had to be strong for Tommy. She had to. As she passed the library, Audrey stopped. The heavy door was open just a crack. A familiar voice came from inside. It was Veronica Sterling. But her voice was not sweet anymore. It was not weak or sad. It was cold and full of victory. It was a vicious sound that made her skin crawl. Audrey knew she should not listen. Eavesdropping was forbidden. Getting caught meant losing her job. But something in that voice made her stay. She pushed herself into a dark corner, her back against the cold wall. She held her breath and listened. "He is still a fool for me." Veronica's voice dripped with hatred. "Do not worry, that old man is stupid. He just drowns himself in memories of his dead wife. So pathetic." Audrey stopped breathing. Old man. She had to be talking about Nico Fontaine, the man she called my love just minutes ago. "Don't worry, baby." Veronica's voice was sickeningly sweet. "After the honeymoon, his end will be just like Kate's. Then nothing will stand in our way." Audrey's heart squeezed tight, just like Kate. Kate Fontaine had died 2 years ago from a heart attack. Everyone in Chicago knew the story. They said Nico was broken after her death, which made him the cold man he was today. But what did that mean? "The inheritance papers are ready," Veronica said with satisfaction. "My lawyer prepared everything. I just need his signature tonight. He trusts me completely." A soft, chilling laugh followed. "I have the medicine. This new type leaves no trace. An autopsy would find nothing. A few more doses, and it is finished. He will sleep forever, just like his poor wife did." Audrey covered her mouth to stop from screaming. Medicine. No trace. Sleep forever. Like Kate. Oh, God. Kate Fontaine did not die from a heart attack. She was murdered, and Veronica Sterling was the killer. "Then you will have it all, baby." Veronica's voice was a soft whisper. "The Fontaine Empire will belong to us. All the money and the power. We just need to be patient. After the wedding, I will take my time. No one will ever know. A young widow grieving her husband. Who would ever suspect me?" Her sharp laugh echoed again. Audrey trembled, her mind racing. The woman whose shoes she just cleaned was a murderer. She had killed Kate Fontaine. Now she was going to kill Nico Fontaine, the man who had just dismissed her without any mercy. He would die never knowing the truth. He was sleeping next to his own killer. Suddenly, she heard high heels clicking inside the room. Veronica was coming to the door. Audrey panicked. If Veronica found her, she would be killed. She knew too much. She turned and ran. Her feet slipped on the marble floor. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She fell once, her knee hitting the floor with a sharp pain. But she kept running. The dark hallway seemed to stretch on forever. The sound of her own breathing was a roar in her ears. Finally, she saw the kitchen door. She threw herself inside, slammed it shut, and leaned against it. She gasped for air, her body shaking uncontrollably. The words she heard twisted in her mind like a horrible dream. Kate was murdered. Nico was next. And she, a simple maid, was the only one who knew. What could she do? Who would believe her? As Audrey burst into the kitchen, she almost crashed into someone. She stumbled back and saw Maggie Torres, a 35-year-old woman with warm brown eyes. Maggie was her closest friend at the mansion. She had been working there for 8 months. Maggie put down a stack of plates, her eyes wide with alarm. "Audrey, what is wrong? My God, your face is completely white. You look like you just saw a ghost." Audrey could not form words. She grabbed Maggie's arm and pulled her into a dark corner of the kitchen, far away from the door. Maggie followed, her face showing confusion and fear. When they were hidden, Audrey turned to her. Her eyes were filled with terror. Her whisper shook. "Maggie, I heard something terrible." It was Veronica. She was on the phone. Audrey explained everything she had heard. She told her about Veronica, calling Nico an idiot. She told her about Kate's death being a setup. She described the medicine that left no trace, and the plan to take over the Fontaine Empire. Maggie stood like a statue, her eyes getting wider with every word. When Audrey was done, Maggie quickly covered Audrey's mouth with her hand, looking around in terror. "Are you insane?" she hissed. "Do not speak so loudly. If someone hears you, we are both dead." "But are you certain? You heard all of it? You did not misunderstand?" "I heard it all, Maggie." Audrey shook her head, her voice full of desperation. "She said she would do it after the honeymoon. She has the medicine and a plan. Maggie, that woman is a monster. She killed Mrs. Kate, and now she will kill the boss." Maggie trembled, leaning against a shelf for support. "But what can we do? Who would believe us?" She looked at Audrey, her eyes filled with helplessness. "We are just maids, Audrey, and this is the Fontaine family, the biggest mafia in Chicago. If we are wrong, we die. If we are right and cannot prove it, we still die." 2. Do you get it? Audrey got it. She understood completely. The world was not fair. A maid's words were worthless against a beautiful woman from high society. A woman who was about to run this house. Suddenly, high heels clicked outside the kitchen. Click, click, click. The sound was steady and clear. It was coming closer. Audrey and Maggie went silent. The blood in their veins felt like ice. They knew who it was. They scrambled behind a tall shelf, trying to make themselves small. The door opened. Veronica Sterling walked in, wearing a stunning turquoise dress. She went to the refrigerator and took out a bottle of water. After a sip, she paused. Her cold blue eyes scanned the room. She sensed something. She knew someone was here. Audrey stopped breathing. Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure Veronica could hear it. Next to her, Maggie was shaking, her hands clamped over her mouth. 1 second passed, then 2, then 3. Time felt frozen. Finally, Veronica shrugged. She set the bottle down and walked out. The sound of her heels faded away. Audrey and Maggie let out their breath at the same time. Their bodies went limp. Maggie grabbed Audrey's hand, her voice a low whisper full of resolve. "We need real proof, Audrey. Without it, our words mean nothing. We cannot convict someone like Veronica Sterling on words alone." Audrey nodded. She understood. But where could they find proof? And who would ever help them? That night, the Fontaine mansion was dark and silent. Audrey lay awake in her small bed in the basement. Her eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling. The words she heard that afternoon played over and over in her mind. Medicine that leaves no trace. Sleep forever. Just like Kate. She tossed and turned, but sleep would not come. Finally, she got up. A short walk might calm her down. Audrey put on a sweater, opened her door, and stepped into the hall. The estate had a haunted feeling at night, so different from the day. Dim lamps cast long, strange shadows on the walls. Her footsteps were quiet on the cold stone floor. As she walked through the main hallway, Audrey stopped. A small figure with white hair stood motionless in front of a large painting. It was Mrs. Patterson, the housekeeper. She had worked for the Fontaines for over 30 years. She had watched Audrey's humiliation that afternoon and said nothing. Audrey started to leave, but she was curious. What was Mrs. Patterson looking at? She moved closer and saw a portrait of a young woman. Her hair was blonde, and her blue eyes were gentle. A warm smile lit up the canvas. It was Kate Fontaine, Nico Fontaine's late wife, the woman Veronica Sterling had murdered. "You heard it too, didn't you?" Mrs. Patterson's sudden voice made Audrey jump. The older woman did not turn. Her eyes stayed on the painting. "I saw you run down the hall this afternoon. I saw the fear on your face. You heard what Miss Veronica said." Audrey was frozen. She did not know what to say. Lying could be dangerous, but telling the truth could be deadly. Mrs. Patterson did not wait for an answer. She sighed, her voice full of a deep sadness. "I know, child. I have known for a long time about Veronica and about what she did to Mrs. Kate." She turned then, her old eyes still sharp, and looked right at Audrey. "Before she died, Mrs. Kate suspected something was wrong. She told me she felt sick after taking the supplements from Dr. Harris, the family doctor. She was tired, dizzy, and her heart would race. But the doctor told her she was just working too hard. Mrs. Patterson looked back at the portrait, her face softening with grief. She was a very smart woman. She knew. She wrote a letter with all her suspicions and hid it. She told me if anything happened to her, I had to find the antique music box. It was a wedding gift from Mr. Nico. A music box? Audrey whispered. Mrs. Patterson nodded. An old wooden box carved with roses. Mr. Nico had it specially made. In Italy, it plays Claire de Lune. That was Mrs. Kate's favorite song. She sighed again. After Mrs. Kate passed, Mr. Nico put all her things in a storage room on the 3rd floor. No one was allowed to touch them. The music box is in there. Mrs. Patterson reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, worn brass key. She pressed it into Audrey's hand. I have kept this for 2 years. 2 years of fear and silence. I am an old woman, child. I am too old and too afraid. She looked at Audrey with a flicker of hope. But you are different. You still have fire in you. I saw it when you cleaned Veronica's shoes without crying. I saw it in the way you ran down that hallway. You have courage. Audrey looked at the key in her palm. Her heart was beating wildly. This was it. This could be the proof. But getting it was a path to death. The storage room was forbidden. The Fontaines did not forgive people who broke their rules. If she were caught, she would not just be fired. She would die. Then she thought of Nico Fontaine, the man with the sad, gray eyes, the man who was about to be killed by the woman he trusted. He was cold and indifferent. He had not helped her, but he did not deserve to die. Nobody deserved that. I will find it, Audrey said. Her voice trembled, but it was firm. I have to. At 2 a.m, the mansion was completely dark and silent. The only sounds were the wind outside and Audrey's own heart. She stood at the bottom of the stairs to the 3rd floor. The old brass key was slick with sweat in her hand. This was a forbidden place. Nico Fontaine had ordered that no one go up there after his wife died. Breaking that rule meant death. Audrey took a deep breath. She thought of Tommy in the hospital. She thought of the hope in Mrs. Patterson's eyes. She thought of Kate Fontaine, who died an unjust death. Then she started up the stairs, one careful step at a time. Sweat dripped down her forehead. Every creak of the floorboards made her heart jump. The darkness was suffocating. Finally, she reached the 3rd floor. The hallway was darker than the rest of the house. A thick layer of dust covered everything. Audrey turned on her phone's flashlight, its weak light cutting through the dark. The door to Kate's storage room was at the end of the hall. It was made of heavy oak. Audrey slid the key into the lock and turned. The metallic screech echoed in the silence. She pushed the door open, stepped inside, and closed it behind her. The room was like a world frozen in time. Dust was everywhere. White cloths covered the furniture like silent ghosts. Audrey shined her light around the room. It stopped on a wedding photograph on the wall. Kate Fontaine was in a white gown, her blonde hair and blue eyes shining with joy. Next to her stood Nico Fontaine, but it was not the Nico that Audrey knew. The man in the picture, he was smiling, a genuine expression filled with love. His gray eyes, once so cold, were now bright with a deep joy. They looked at one another as if nothing else in the world existed. Audrey's heart ached. This was the true Nico Fontaine, before sorrow consumed him, before Veronica Sterling took the woman he loved. Wiping a tear, she forced herself to concentrate. Time was running out. Audrey scanned the room. A closet held expensive dresses, a faint perfume clinging to them. The vanity was full of jewelry. A shelf contained romance novels. But there was no music box. She checked under the table and behind the curtains. Nothing. Every second was a risk. Audrey finally dropped to her knees, looking under the bed. A beam of light hit a dark corner, and then she saw it. A dusty wooden trunk sat in the shadows. She pulled it out, her hands shaking as she opened it. Inside were photographs and letters. Tucked in a corner, wrapped in velvet, was the music box. Audrey lifted it with care. It was an antique, carved with roses so real they seemed to breathe. She opened the lid. The soft, sad melody of Claire de Lune filled the silent night. The notes spoke of a beautiful love destroyed by cruelty. Then Audrey noticed it. Under the velvet was a folded letter and a small silver drive. She took the letter, her hands trembling so much she could barely open it. "My beloved Nico," she read, "if you are reading this, I am gone. I am sorry I never told you. I was afraid. Veronica is not who you think she is. I saw her with another man they call the Fox. I heard them planning something awful. Dr. Harris gives me medicine that makes me weaker each day. I think he is poisoning me. I recorded what I could on the drive. Please, my love, be safe. Do not let her hurt you. I will love you forever. Yours, Kate." Tears fell on the page, blurring the words. Audrey wept for Kate Fontaine, who faced death while thinking only of her husband. She wept for Nico, who lost his wife without knowing why. And she wept for herself. A simple maid holding a secret that could ruin everything. The letter and the drive were proof. They were weapons. But first, she had to escape. Audrey quickly folded the letter and put it in her pocket with the drive. Her heart pounded wildly. She placed the music box back inside the trunk and slid it under the bed. As she stood up to leave, the lights flashed on. The sudden brightness blinded her for a moment. When she opened her eyes, her world fell apart. Veronica Sterling stood in the doorway, a smug smile on her face. She wore a red silk robe, her icy eyes fixed on Audrey. "Well now," Veronica's voice was slow and dangerous. "What is this?" A little mouse sneaking where she should not be. Audrey stumbled backward against the bed. She fought to keep her expression neutral, but her heart was beating loud enough for Veronica to hear. "Miss Veronica." The woman stepped into the room, her heels clicking on the floor. Her eyes moved from the trunk to the disturbed dust, then locked onto Audrey's pale face. "What were you looking for, little mouse?" Veronica's voice was sickeningly sweet. "Who gave you permission to enter this room? You know it is forbidden." Audrey's throat was dry. "I got lost. I could not sleep, so I went for a walk and took a wrong turn." Veronica let out a cold laugh that cut through the silence. "Lost? At 2 in the morning? Into a locked room? Do you think I am a fool?" She came closer, each step a threat. Soon she stood right in front of Audrey, looking down at her with pure contempt. "What are you hiding?" Veronica demanded. Without waiting for a reply, she grabbed Audrey's collar. Before Audrey could move, Veronica was searching her apron. Fingers with red nails dug into every pocket. Audrey held her breath. The evidence was in an inner pocket, not the apron. A moment later, Veronica found nothing. She shoved Audrey away, her eyes still narrowed with suspicion. "You are playing a game," Veronica hissed. "I will find out what it is. A filthy maid like you cannot fool me." Audrey stayed silent, looking at the floor. She knew any word could make things worse. Veronica studied her, deciding what to do with her prey. Then, a cruel smile spread across her face. "You know, I do not need to know what you are doing." Veronica's voice became calm, which was even more terrifying. "I just need to get rid of you. You entered a forbidden place. That is reason enough for you to disappear from this house and from Chicago." She pulled out her phone and dialed a number. Audrey wanted to scream, to run, but any sudden move would only confirm her guilt. Nico, my love. Veronica's voice became sweet and fragile, a familiar performance. I am so sorry to wake you, but you need to come to Kate's room. I caught a little mouse in here. She hung up and gave Audrey a triumphant look. Now we wait, little mouse, to see how your boss deals with you. Heavy footsteps echoed on the stairs. Nico Fontaine appeared, his handsome face tight with exhaustion and anger. He wore a wrinkled shirt, his gray eyes tired and red. Behind him was Finn O'Brien, his bodyguard, a large man with a cold expression. Nico's gaze fell on Audrey. She stood trembling in the dusty room, her face white with fear. You, Nico's voice was like ice. You dared to come in here. Before Audrey could speak, Veronica rushed to Nico's side. She clung to his arm, her eyes wide with fake tears. Nico? Her voice was a fragile whisper. I heard a noise and came to check. I found her going through Kate's things. I think she was stealing. Audrey wanted to deny it, but no words came out. She watched Veronica's perfect act with a feeling of complete despair. Stealing. Nico's voice was full of disgust. You would steal from my dead wife. No, I did not, Audrey finally managed to say. Check her pockets, Nico, Veronica said, her voice full of false concern. Kate's diamond necklace is gone from its box. The one from your anniversary. See if she has it. Nico gave a sharp nod to Finn. The bodyguard moved toward Audrey, his face unreadable. I am sorry, Finn said, and began to search her. Audrey froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. The letter and drive were hidden in her inner pocket, as long as he did not search there. But then the unthinkable happened. As Finn checked her apron, something shiny fell to the floor. It was a diamond necklace. Audrey stared at it in horror. She had not touched it. She did not even know it was there, but she understood. When Veronica had searched her earlier, she was not looking for anything. She was planting the necklace. The trap was sprung. I did not take it, Audrey cried, her voice breaking. She put it there. You have to believe me. But Nico was not listening. His gray eyes were filled with cold contempt as he bent down and picked up the necklace, touching a memory of his dead wife. I gave you a place in this house. Nico's voice was low. Each word was a stone on Audrey's chest. I overlooked the incident with the tea, and you repay me by stealing from my wife and entering a room I forbade. Mr. Fontaine, you have to listen, Audrey pleaded, her tears falling. I am not a thief. I came here for something important. You are in danger. She pointed a shaking finger at Veronica. She will kill you just like she killed Kate. The room fell into a deep silence. Nico stood like a statue, his gray eyes unreadable. Then Veronica broke the quiet with a soft, pitying laugh. The poor thing, she said, her voice dripping with false concern. The girl is clearly unstable. She is inventing stories to avoid being punished. Nico, do not listen to her. She is just a dirty thief. Nico stared at Audrey for another moment before turning away. His shoulders tightened as he gripped the diamond necklace. Get her out of here. His voice was cold and empty. Make sure she never finds work in this city again. The Fontaine family has no place for traitors. Finn nodded and moved to grab Audrey's arm. She fought back. She screamed a final warning. Please listen. Kate was murdered. You are next. She left proof. But nobody listened. Finn dragged her from the room and down the long, dark hallways. Audrey kept shouting, but it was useless. She was just a maid. Her words meant nothing in a world of powerful men. The iron gates of the estate closed behind her, with a loud clang that echoed in the night. Audrey stood in the darkness at 3 a.m. She had no money, no phone, and nowhere to go. She had only the clothes she was wearing and a heart full of despair. But then, she felt inside her pocket. The letter was still there. The USB was safe. Veronica had won the battle. But the war was not over. The Chicago wind felt like tiny knives on Audrey's skin. She walked down an empty road in thin shoes soaked with dew. She was alone and had nothing. But Kate's letter and the small USB drive were still in her pocket. They were the proof that could save a man who was sleeping next to his enemy. Audrey walked for almost an hour through the city. She passed magnificent mansions and then blocks of old, stacked apartments. She had only one destination: Maggie Torres's small apartment. It was on the fourth floor of a decaying building. The concrete stairs were cracked, and the halls smelled like dampness. Audrey climbed each step, her legs aching. She knocked on the door. At 4 in the morning, Maggie opened it wearing wrinkled pajamas. Her dark hair was a mess, and her eyes were sleepy. But when she saw Audrey, she was instantly awake. "Oh my God," Maggie gasped, pulling Audrey inside. "What happened to you? You are as white as a ghost. Your lips are purple from the cold. Come in." Audrey collapsed onto a worn-out sofa. Maggie wrapped her in a blanket and gave her hot tea. Then Audrey told her everything. Breaking into Kate's room, the music box with the hidden letter, Veronica's trap with the diamond necklace that fell from her pocket, Nico's cold dismissal as he had her thrown out. When she finished, Maggie was silent, her face pale with shock. "That witch," Maggie whispered through clenched teeth. "She planned this from the very beginning." Audrey nodded and took out the letter and the USB, "But I still have this. It is the proof that Mrs. Kate left. We have to see what is on this drive." Maggie found her old laptop and plugged in the USB. A folder with several files appeared on the screen. The first file was a video that Kate Fontaine had secretly recorded. In it, Veronica Sterling was kissing a stranger. He was tall with black hair and a long scar on his left cheek. Their voices were too low to hear clearly, but it was obviously not an innocent meeting. The second file was a recording of Dr. Harris, the family physician. He spoke clearly. "The dosage for Mrs. Kate must be increased. She is becoming suspicious. We need to act faster." The other files were pictures. There were receipts for chemicals from a drug company. There were also messages between Veronica and a man she called Baby. The messages said, "Everything is going as planned, and soon it will all be ours." Maggie's hands shook as she read. "This is real. Mrs. Kate was murdered. It was not a heart attack. She was poisoned, and Veronica did it." "We need to go to the police," Maggie said firmly. But Audrey shook her head. "We cannot. The Fontaine family controls half of the Chicago police. They would bury this evidence. Veronica would know right away, and she would destroy everything." "Then what do we do?" Maggie asked, her voice filled with despair. Audrey looked out the window as the black sky turned to gray. Dawn was breaking. The wedding was this afternoon, in less than 12 hours. "I have to give the proof directly to Nico," Audrey said, her voice surprisingly calm. "At the wedding today." Maggie looked at her like she had lost her mind. "Are you crazy? You will never get past security. They fired you. They know your face. They will grab you as soon as you get near the church." "I know," Audrey said, her green eyes filled with resolve. "But I have to try. It is his only chance. If I do nothing, Nico Fontaine will die. I cannot live with that." Audrey could not sleep. She sat on the sofa in Maggie's apartment, watching the evidence on the laptop again and again. Each time she saw something new: the look of victory in Veronica's eyes, the coldness in Dr. Harris's voice, the messages about their plan and their future. Kate knew she was going to die. She tried to leave a warning for her husband, but Nico never saw it. Now, 2 years later, it was happening all over again. Audrey looked at the dark sky. She thought about her brother, Tommy, in the hospital. He did not know his sister had been framed and thrown onto the street. He was a 16-year-old boy with a weak heart, waiting for a surgery to save his life. $200,000. That number felt more impossible than ever. If Audrey died tomorrow, who would care for Tommy? Who would pay his bills? But if she did nothing, an innocent man would die. Veronica Sterling, a killer, would walk free with the wealth she had stolen. Audrey saw Maggie's phone on the table. She needed to hear Tommy's voice one last time. She picked it up and dialed the hospital. Tommy answered, his voice weak but happy. "Audrey, why are you calling so early? It is only 5 in the morning. Are you okay? You sound tired." Audrey fought back tears and made her voice sound normal. "I am fine. I just worked late and wanted to hear you." "You work too hard," Tommy said with worry in his voice. "Do not worry about me. The doctor says I am getting better. Soon I can walk around the room. You need to eat well, okay? Do not skip meals to save money for me." Tears streamed down Audrey's cheeks. She managed a smile, knowing Tommy could not see it. "You're being such a good boy. I love you, Tommy. Always remember that. No matter what happens, I love you." "What are you saying? That sounds strange." Tommy laughed. "You sound like you are going far away. I love you too. I will see you soon." "Okay." Audrey's throat felt tight, her voice unsteady. "Yes, I will see you soon." She ended the call and let her tears come. She wept for Tommy, for herself, and for the terrifying path ahead. Maggie sat beside her, holding her hand in silence. When morning came, Audrey rose. She put on the maid uniform one last time and hid the music box with its letter and the drive in an inside pocket. Maggie stood at the door, her eyes red. She hugged Audrey tightly, her voice thick. "Be careful. Please come. Back to me. I will be waiting." Audrey nodded, then released her. "I will try." She walked into the morning, the sun on her face. Before her was the road to St. Patrick's Cathedral, to the wedding of the century, and to a fate that would decide her life and Nico Fontaine's. St. Patrick's Cathedral rose from the heart of Chicago, a timeless Gothic structure. Today it was decorated with thousands of pure white flowers and silver ribbons. The wedding of Chicago's most powerful mafia boss had captured the city's attention. Hundreds of luxury cars, from Rolls-Royce to Bentley, lined the street. The security was overwhelming. Bodyguards in black suits stood everywhere. Metal detectors guarded each entrance, and the guest list was checked with extreme care, one name at a time. Audrey watched from behind a tree across the street, her heart hammering. She knew the main doors were impossible. Her face was known, her name on a blacklist. Any guard who saw her would seize her immediately. She circled to the back, where a service entrance was busy with staff. Catering trucks were parked, and workers carried supplies inside. A middle-aged woman in a server's uniform hurried past and saw Audrey. "Hey you, are you new with the service team? Stop standing there. We are very short-handed. Get inside now." Audrey nodded, keeping her expression calm. "Yes, I was lost. I did not know which door to use. Follow me." The woman grabbed her hand and pulled her into the kitchen. Just like that, Audrey was inside the church. Her heart pounded and a cold sweat formed on her forehead. The first step was done, but it was only the start. Audrey moved through the crowded kitchen, trying to look like she belonged. As she entered a side hallway, she froze. Finn O'Brien, Nico's bodyguard, was walking just ahead. Audrey ducked behind a stone pillar and held her breath. Her heart was beating so hard, Audrey thought he might hear it. Finn walked past. Then he paused. Audrey did not move. Her body was rigid. Finn scanned the hallway, as if sensing something was wrong. After a few seconds, he shrugged and continued on his way. Audrey breathed again, her legs so weak she almost fell. But there was no time for fear. She had to move. She followed the corridor toward the main hall. She could hear music from inside, along with the sound of hundreds of guests. She was getting close. The door in front of her opened. Veronica Sterling stepped out before Audrey could react. She was radiant in a white wedding gown, her bridesmaids following her. Audrey turned her face away, pretending to wipe a picture on the wall. Her heart felt like it stopped. If Veronica saw her, this was all over. Veronica walked by, leaving a trail of expensive perfume. She was laughing with her bridesmaids, her voice full of triumph. She never glanced at Audrey. She did not recognize the maid she had thrown out the night before. When the footsteps disappeared, Audrey dared to breathe. Her body was still shaking, but she pushed forward. Finally, she reached the main hall of the cathedral. She stood in the shadows and looked out at the scene. 500 guests from high society sat in pews of red velvet. Politicians, tycoons, and crime lords were all there, dressed in expensive clothes and jewels to see the wedding of the century. There were flowers and candles everywhere. At the front, before the altar, Nico Fontaine was waiting. He wore a perfect black suit, his hair neat, but his gray eyes were empty. He looked like a man walking toward his own death. Audrey touched the music box inside her uniform. The letter and the drive were safe. The proof that could save his life was still there. Now or never, she told herself. The wedding music began to play. The guests stood and turned. Veronica Sterling entered, wearing $1 million gown. It was pure white, with a long train covered in thousands of crystals. A priceless veil covered her face, and she held a bouquet of white roses. She was glowing, like a queen entering her kingdom. The guests whispered in admiration as cameras flashed. Veronica smiled, victorious. She moved toward the altar, toward Nico, and toward the bloody future she had planned. Audrey held the music box tightly. It was time. Veronica Sterling stood next to Nico Fontaine, her white gown shining. She gave him her hand, her smile as bright as a queen's. Nico took it, his face still blank, like a man in a dream. The priest stood at the altar, his deep voice filling the church. Today we are gathered to witness the holy union of Nico Fontaine and Veronica Sterling. Audrey stood in a far corner, her heart pounding. She did not have much time. Once he said, "I do, it would be finished." Veronica would legally be Mrs. Fontaine, and Nico would be her prey. With no other choice, Audrey started moving. She pushed past guests who stared at her with suspicion and annoyance. "Who are you? Where are you going? Why are you pushing?" Audrey did not stop. She kept her eyes on Nico at the end of the long aisle. As she got closer, the guards began to notice the strange maid, acting so strangely. The priest's voice continued, slow and deep. "Nico Fontaine, do you take Veronica Sterling to be your lawful wedded wife, to love and cherish her, in sickness and in health, until death parts you?" Nico opened his mouth to speak. "Stop!" Audrey's shout cut through the quiet cathedral, echoing off the high ceilings like thunder. 500 heads turned to stare at the small maid standing in the aisle. Veronica turned pale, her eyes wide with shock. She knew it was Audrey, the little mouse she had thrown out the night before, who was supposed to be gone. Audrey did not hesitate. She ran toward the front, her shoes slapping on the marble floor. Guards moved in from all sides like wolves, but she was faster. She grabbed Nico's arm, her green eyes locked on his gray ones. "Mr. Fontaine, you have to see this. She is going to kill you, just like she killed Kate." Nico flinched, his blank expression finally breaking. "You, what are you doing here? Are you insane?" "Security!" Veronica screamed, her voice filled with panic. "Get this lunatic out of here, right now. She is crazy." Guards grabbed Audrey's arms, but she held on to Nico. She tightened her grip and shouted with all her remaining strength. "Kate was murdered. Veronica killed her, and she will kill you too. I have proof the words hung in the silent church. 500 guests were frozen. No one moved. Nico stared at Audrey, and for the first time, his gray eyes were not empty. He saw something in her eyes. It was not madness, as Veronica claimed. It was not delusion, not someone ill. He saw raw desperation and a fire he had never seen before. Before the guards reached her, Audrey pulled Nico with all her strength toward the coat room, near the altar. He did not know why, but he followed her. The coat room door slammed shut behind them. Outside, chaos erupted. Veronica screamed. Her beautiful face twisted in rage and fear. The guests began to whisper and move around. Guards pounded on the door. But inside the small room, there were only two people. Nico Fontaine, the most powerful man in Chicago, and Audrey Shaw, the maid he had fired. They stood facing each other, breathing hard. This was the moment that would change everything. It was small. It held a large mirror, some chairs, and one dim lamp. The noise from outside faded away, leaving only the sound of two people breathing hard. Audrey was panting, her hands shaking as she reached into her pocket. Nico Fontaine stood before her, his features cold. His gray eyes were filled with rage. "You have 30 seconds to explain," Nico said. His voice was low and hard. 30 seconds before I let them deal with you. Why should I believe a thief I already fired? A woman who broke into my wife's room. A woman who just ruined my wedding in front of 500 guests. Audrey did not look away from his cold stare. She had risked too much to fail now. She had only one step left. "You do not have to believe me," Audrey said. Her voice was steady. "Just believe Kate." Then Audrey presented a wooden music box. It was an antique, carved with roses that looked real. Though aged, its beauty was stunning. Nico froze. His gray eyes widened, his cold composure shattering. He knew that box. How could he forget it? He had ordered it from Florence as a wedding gift for Kate. It was a relic from a love he thought was lost forever. "This is Kate's." Nico's voice was strained. "Where did you find it?" "Mrs. Patterson gave me the key," Audrey said, placing it in his hands. "Kate left a message for you. She knew what was happening. She wanted you to have the truth." Nico held the box with trembling hands. These fingers had ordered deaths in the city's underworld. Now they shook uncontrollably. He opened it. The soft, painful notes of Claire de Lune filled the room. It was Kate's favorite song. It was their wedding dance from 7 years ago. He used to hum it to her when she felt sick. Nico stood like a statue, letting the music wash over him. Then he noticed it. A folded letter was hidden beneath the velvet lining. He recognized her handwriting immediately. It was Kate's gentle script, with the little circles she used for dots. He had seen it on 100 love letters. Nico started reading, and his world fell apart. Every sentence was a fresh wound to his heart. "Veronica is not who you think she is. I saw her with another man they call the Fox. Dr. Harris gives me supplements that make me feel weaker. I think they are poisoning me." Nico's expression shifted with each word. Doubt became shock. Shock became pain. Pain became a white-hot fury. His hand clenched, wrinkling the paper, and then something impossible happened. Tears streamed down the face of Chicago's coldest Mafia boss. He had not cried in 2 years, not even at Kate's funeral. He had not cried as her casket was lowered into the ground. He had become a man made of ice, but the dam broke. "Kate, my love." His voice was a shattered whisper. "I am so sorry." Audrey said nothing, letting him grieve. She held out a phone. She had taken it from a guest's purse on her way in. "There is more," she said softly. "This USB has videos." Kate recorded everything. Nico took the device, his hands still shaking. He watched Veronica with a scarred man. They were kissing, planning a future without him. He heard Dr. Harris discuss Kate's dosage. He read messages between Veronica and her lover, filled with an affection she never showed him. Nico collapsed into a chair, his body shaking. For 2 years, he had shared a bed with his wife's murderer. He was seconds away from marrying his greatest enemy. He had been so blind. After a long moment, Nico rose. He wiped his face, straightened his collar, and smoothed his suit. When he looked up, his gray eyes were transformed. The emptiness of his grief was gone. The coldness was replaced by the sharp focus of a predator. He was a mafia boss, preparing to destroy an enemy. He gave Audrey a look of deep gratitude. "Thank you." Then he walked to the door. It burst open. Nico Fontaine emerged, his face a mask of ice, his eyes like razors. Audrey followed, her own heart pounding. She knew the worst was over. 500 guests were whispering anxiously. Guards stood ready to grab her. But Nico walked right past them. Veronica ran to him, her expensive dress flowing behind her. Her face was a perfect picture of fake concern. "Nico, you are finally out." "What did that crazy girl tell you?" "Do not listen to her lies. She is just angry that you fired her." "Darling, please look at me." Nico did not look at her. He did not say a word. He walked to the front of the cathedral, where the priest waited in confusion. Nico stood at the microphone. His cold gaze swept across the 500 faces. Then he spoke. "The wedding is canceled." His voice was like steel. There was no emotion, no doubt. The words hit the crowd like a physical blow. The cathedral fell silent. No one moved. Then the whispers started. "What is going on? Is Fontaine insane?" What did the maid tell him? Veronica was frozen in the aisle, her face ghostly white. She could not process his words. This could not be happening. After 2 years of planning, after murdering Kate, after seducing Nico, she had been so close. "No," she screamed in panic. "You cannot do this. We are about to be married. You cannot end it like this." She ran to him and grabbed his arm, her eyes filling with tears. "My love, she is lying to ruin us. Believe me." Nico threw her hand off him like it was poison. His gray eyes finally met hers, and the look in them stopped her cold. There was no coldness left. There was only raw, consuming hatred. "Explain what?" Nico's voice was a low growl. "Explain how you murdered my wife. Or you could just tell me your plan to murder me after the honeymoon." All color left Veronica's face. She swayed on her feet. "What are you saying?" Nico ignored her and faced Finn. His voice was completely empty of emotion. "Call Detective Morrison. Tell him I have proof in Catherine Fontaine's murder. Video, audio, and her own handwritten letter. I want him here now." Veronica stared, her mouth hanging open, her skin like paper. This was impossible. How did he find out? Kate died 2 years ago. Every trace was gone. No one knew. "And contact the brothers," Nico added, his tone flat. "Find the fox, Derek Lawson. I want his location within the hour." Veronica flinched as if shocked. Horror filled her eyes. "You know about Derek?" "I do now," Nico said. His voice was colder than stone. "Kate left me everything. The video of you kissing your lover, the audio of Dr. Harris talking about the poison dose, every message you sent to the man you called baby. It is all here." Veronica's eyes shot to Audrey, who stood near Nico. In that moment, the beautiful mask shattered. Her angelic face twisted into a demonic snarl. Her blue eyes burned with pure hate as her body shook with rage. "You!" Veronica shrieked like a wild beast. "This is your fault, you worthless maid. I will kill you." She lunged toward Audrey, a predator with claws outstretched. But Finn moved faster. The bodyguard caught her from behind. locking her in his arms. Veronica fought like a madwoman, screaming nonsense. "Let go of me. Let me go. I am Nico Fontaine's wife. I own this city. You cannot touch me." "You are nothing," Nico said, his voice terrifyingly cold. "You are just a killer about to face justice." He looked at Finn. "Hold her. The police will arrive in 10 minutes." The 500 guests were frozen, watching the scene in shock. Phones were already out, recording everything. The wedding of the century had just become the arrest of the century. Veronica Sterling, who moments before looked like a queen, was now a criminal screaming in a guard's arms. During the chaos, Veronica saw an opening. As Finn was distracted for a second, she tore herself free. She shoved another guard aside and bolted for the back exit of the church. Her expensive wedding gown trailed behind her like a white funeral shroud, the sewn-in crystals scattered across the floor. She ignored the shouts and screams behind her. Only one thought pounded in her head. Run. Get away. The black limo was still waiting by the rear door. It was supposed to take the newlyweds to their reception. Veronica dove into the car and yelled at the driver. "The airport. Now. I will give you $1 million if you get me there in 30 minutes. The vehicle sped away, leaving St. Patrick's Cathedral behind. In the back, Veronica's trembling hands found her purse. Inside was a fake passport for Emily Carter, a large amount of cash, and a burner phone. This was her plan B, prepared long ago. She ripped off her veil and tiara, then struggled in the tight space to pull a simple black coat on over the huge dress. The jewels went into a small bag. She tied her blonde hair back. In the mirror, Veronica Sterling vanished, replaced by a tired woman running for her life. "Just get on the plane," she whispered, trying to calm herself. "Get to Europe. Derek has people in Paris. I can start over." The car screeched to a halt at O'Hare. Veronica threw cash at the driver and ran for the international terminal. She pushed through the crowds, her eyes scanning for any threat. She saw nothing. No police, just normal travelers. She breathed a sigh of relief and walked to the Air France counter. The flight to Paris left in 2 hours. She handed over the fake passport. "One first-class ticket to Paris, please." The agent looked at the passport and typed on the computer. "Of course, Miss Carter." One moment, Veronica's heart hammered in her chest. Her eyes kept darting around the airport. Get the ticket. Get through security. Get on the plane. Then she would be safe. "Where do you think you are going, Veronica?" A cold, familiar voice spoke behind her. Her blood turned to ice. She slowly turned and faced her worst nightmare. Nico Fontaine stood there in his black tuxedo, his gray eyes like frozen steel. Finn O'Brien was beside him, along with a man she knew was Detective Morrison from the Chicago Police Department. Dozens of uniformed officers were closing off the area. "How?" Veronica whispered, her face completely white. "How did you find me? Did you forget?" Nico said, walking closer. "I run this city. Every exit from Chicago is watched by my people. The airport, the train station, every bus depot. Where did you think you could go?" Veronica backed away until she hit the counter. She tried her most seductive smile. "Nico, my love, let me explain. The maid is lying. I love you. Only you." "Be quiet," Nico snapped. His voice cut like glass. "I have Kate's letter and her recordings. I have a video of you with your lover planning my death. Dr. Harris confessed 20 minutes ago. The game is over. The mask disappeared for good, her face warped with pure madness. "So what?" she screamed, her voice raw. "Kate was weak. She was not good enough for you. She did not know how to be a wife. I did all of this for us." "There was never an us," Nico replied, his voice chilling. "There was only your greed. You love my money and my power, not me. Then Veronica saw Audrey standing behind Nico, the quiet maid who had ruined everything. Pure rage took over. Veronica launched herself at Audrey like an animal. You! I would have had it all if not for you. I am going to kill you. Officers swarmed her immediately, forcing her to the ground. The sharp click of handcuffs echoed as they locked around her wrists. They pulled Veronica to her feet. Her face was a mess of tears and makeup, her hair a tangled wreck. Her black coat was crooked, her red nails broken. The proud queen was gone, leaving only a pathetic criminal being dragged away by the law. The crowd at the airport filmed every second of her downfall. Nico, Veronica shrieked one last time. You will regret this. Nico did not even look at her. The only thing I regret, he said, his voice flat, is not seeing the truth sooner. 3 months later, the trial ended. Veronica Sterling received a life sentence with no chance of parole. She screamed hysterically in the courtroom and had to be removed by force. Dr. Warren Harris got 15 years as an accomplice. The fox, Derek Lawson, was caught in a joint raid and faced numerous charges. The bloody wedding case was front-page news for weeks. It was a story of betrayal and justice, and at the center of it was a young woman they called the silent hero, Audrey Shaw, the 28-year-old maid who risked everything. News crews tried to find her. Television shows wanted her interview, but Audrey said no to them all. She did not want fame. She did not want fame or attention. She just wanted a peaceful life away from the city's elite. One day, Audrey visited Tommy at the University of Chicago Medical Center. She was preparing to ask the doctor for more time to find the money for his surgery. But the doctor met her with a wide smile. Miss Shaw, I have wonderful news. Tommy's surgery is scheduled for next week. The full cost has been paid. Audrey stood in shock, certain she had heard wrong. $200,000? Who paid for it? The doctor just smiled. An anonymous donor. They asked us not to reveal their name. Audrey knew at once. Only one person had that kind of power. Only one person owed her a debt. Tears of joy streamed down her face. The surgery was a success. Tommy's recovery was fast. The doctors were amazed. A strong, healthy heart now beat inside the 16-year-old boy. For the first time, Tommy could run and play like his friends. Audrey hugged her brother, crying with relief. You are going to be fine now. You are safe. Across the city, Nico Fontaine was also changing. He started a charity called Kate's Hope Foundation to help women and children who had been victims of deceit. He gave 80% of his own fortune to the foundation and turned his business over to Finn. Finn stood in his office, stunned. Boss, are you sure? You spent 20 years building this. Nico looked out the window, his eyes no longer icy. I have been in the dark for too long, Finn. Kate always wanted me to find the light. It is time I listen. That afternoon, Nico visited Kate's grave. He placed a bouquet of her favorite white roses on the marble headstone. I am sorry I failed to protect you, he said, his voice quiet. I was blind for 2 years, but the truth is out now. The person who hurt you has paid for it, and I met someone who reminds me of you. She has the same courage and the same kindness. She saved me, Kate, just like you did. A soft wind blew through the cemetery, rustling the rose petals. Nico smiled for the first time in years, as if he could feel Kate's answer. 6 months later, Audrey Shaw's life was completely different. She and Tommy lived in a small, lovely house in the suburbs. It had a flower garden and a white picket fence. It was not a mansion, just a home. Their small apartment was a true home, filled with laughter. In the yard, 16-year-old Tommy was a flash of motion. his new heart letting him finally be a kid. Audrey tended her garden, a peaceful smile on her face. Then an old green Jeep stopped outside. Nico Fontaine stepped out, but he was a different man. He wore a simple shirt and pants, not the expensive suit of a cold mob boss. His face looked healthier, and his once cold gray eyes held a surprising warmth. "Uncle Nico!" Tommy yelled, running for a hug. Nico laughed, a genuine sound, and ruffled the boy's hair. "The doctor says I am strong as an ox," Tommy boasted. "Will you play catch?" "In a moment," Nico promised. "I need to speak with your sister." As Audrey approached, her heart beat with a strange nervousness she could not explain. The silence between them was heavy. After all they had been through, simple words were hard. Nico finally spoke. "You saved me, Audrey. Not just from Veronica, but from the man I was becoming." He paused. "I am opening a community center for families that need help, and I want you to run it. I need someone who knows what it means to fight, someone like you." Shocked, Audrey could only stare as he stepped closer and took her hand. "You are the bravest person I know," he said softly. "Give me a chance. Not as a boss, but just as me." Looking into his warm eyes, she smiled. "I would like that." Tommy's call to play broke the moment. They laughed and walked toward him, hand in hand, as the sunset cast a golden glow. They had no fortune, only a small home, a quiet evening, and the start of a new life together. True strength is not power, but the courage to change. This story shows how one ordinary person doing the right thing can change everything. Real love is not about perfection, but sincerity and sacrifice. Thank you for listening. What did this story mean to you? Have you ever met someone as brave as Audrey? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe, like, and share it. With your support, we can share more moving stories. We wish you health and peace. Goodbye for now, and we will see you again very soon. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful lessons and inspiration to our audience.